Well, thank you so much. I want to thank MN-STAC for inviting me to speak today, to our folks over at the University of Minnesota U4 Lab for having me today at the forum. My name is Molly Codding. If we haven't met before, I'm the Community Environmental Justice Coordinator here at the DNR. I started last year. I was hired in 2022, and my position is funded through the state as well as the USDA Forest Service. Both of these sort of cutting edge commitments were made recognizing the need for more concerted investment in environmental justice here in Minnesota. We're one of 4 states that have a dedicated canopy, equity, or environmental justice coordinator, and I'm really grateful to my team here today who've been so supportive and collaborative here at the DNR. Some things that I think are helpful for the audience to know about me and where I come from. I have a background in public health and healthcare delivery, so I approach this work with really a deep appreciation of upstream determinants of health. And if you haven't heard of that concept, it sort of applies to how our physical environment, things like our employment and income and social cohesion, affect a community's ability to stay healthy. I've grounded my environmental health experience in efforts to make sure we're taking good care of communities well, or through taking good care of the environment. I've also led environmental stewardship volunteer efforts, facilitated community organizing efforts, and I've even earned my tree care advisory or advocate certificate with the U of M. So there's a lot of friends in this room who've known me for a long while. I think something that's really unique about my unorthodox background and how I arrived here is I see a lot of different paths to accomplishing our goals of helping Minnesota communities move towards environmental justice by centering their priorities, strengths, and needs. My background also keeps me very humble because I don't have, took a roundabout way to get here. I don't have a lot of the same identities of many of the communities that we serve and who experience environmental injustice. And I also don't have the technical training of a lot of the partners we rely on to do this work. In our community forestry program here at the DNR, we rely on these partnerships to accomplish the state's goals and plans. And we couldn't do our work without partnerships with community members, with community forest managers, a host of nonprofits, local units of government, and other state agencies. Much of my work centers relationships, building trust and demonstrating care and commitment to what matters most to communities who experience inequities day in and day out and much more widely than the trees that they have access to. I'm learning and relearning the art of patience and letting go of perfection, showing up as a whole human and inviting others to do the same. And I hope that by holding space for these relationships and this kind of intentional coordination, I'm supporting everyone's capacity, resiliency, and sustainability to maintain healthy forests and invest in healthy communities. Longest intro ever. Did we skip forward? There we are. So we are going to go through a lot of information today, but I really want to center us in some of those central themes that I brought up: intentionality and relationships. So if you'd humor me online or in person, we're going to start off and take a moment to think about a couple of these intentions, intentionality and relationships. So I want you to take a moment to think about the ways you already show up intentionally. Today in this discussion, day-to-day, tree care professionals are incredibly practical, tangible, and present people. You already possess these skills. Our urban and community forestry managers do this work because it matters. They've understood this long before the broader awareness of its ties and intersections with justice and climate resiliency, long before recent investments from the state and federal government, and they'll do so long after this moment that we're having. So you're responding to this current moment and this opportunity with a desire to learn, grow, and listen to new ways of working with community members. You're here now, and I'm really grateful for that intentionality. It's what gives me hope and an excitement for the future. Then I want you to think about the relationships that you already nurture, be they in our profession through communities like MN-STAC, or in your neighborhood, your town, our state. I encourage you to visualize these concentric circles of trust and cooperation and working towards goals bigger than your own work. I want you to bring an awareness of this positionality and influence that you already possess, and invite you to consider how these networks can be broadened, enriched, and benefit from connecting with communities who haven't had a seat at the table. And they might not share your identity or your background, but where you have these mutual goals and desires, I hope that we can begin to see ourselves as channels for justice, for that healthier environment that we're all looking for. I trust that you're already doing this actively, subconsciously, passively, but I thank you so much for joining us today and talking a little bit more about how we're going to go about engaging communities in a more holistic way. This is kind of a disclaimer. So, here at the DNR, we want to meet communities where they're at in terms of their level of understanding and comfort discussing environmental justice and the need for holistic community engagement, especially around canopy equity, systemic injustices, and the tools we need to dismantle them. We understand that some of you have been doing this work for a really long time, and some of you are new to the discussion. So I hope folks are okay with me laying out just a few fundamental principles, basic definitions to make sure we're all operating under the same understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about injustices and the impact they have on canopy and equity. Similarly, we have a lot of new faces and new partners in community forestry, and that's super exciting. And I just want to recognize that there's a lot of value in acknowledging the work that it's taken to arrive at this moment. With historic levels of investment through state and IRA funding, it's also important to acknowledge that this investment hasn't been realized yet. So we are still the same capacity in this weird limbo space of planning and stretching to build. We know that we need more resources to prepare our forests for the future, but we haven't had a long time to build some of these environmental justice relationships and understand the most pressing needs, let alone be able to address them. So I hope you're okay with us walking through that history a little bit for folks that are new to community forestry. I'm going to try and do so quickly and welcome your feedback, because this is the first time we've offered something like this, and we really want to understand what's useful, where do we need to dig down deeper, drill down, and where can we just kind of smooth over and just focus in on what you need. So as we examine the need for, I didn't even go through the definition. So here's the definition of environmental justice. There are so many. You could look up the EPA's definition, USDA's, or other academic institutions and their grounding of the term. But we know that environmental injustice is a systemic problem. It rests on decades and centuries of harm caused by racism, classism, and colonialism. So environmental justice, to me, ensures that all people have a right to live in healthy and safe communities and are involved in decision-making processes that affect their environment. This is a right for all people. And because it's a systemic issue that we're dealing with, it can't be solved by individual choices or siloed approaches. It has to be accomplished through intentional programming, policy changes, and actions that ensure equity. As we examine the need for environmental justice engagement, it's not just a checkbox, right, or an optional activity, but it's actually integral to our success in delivering IRA-funded programming or being able to address environmental justice concerns through our state funding or other state programs that address this. Recognizing the background and foundations of injustice present across the United States, but that also includes Minnesota, let's look at one major systemic cause of injustice that impacts canopy cover, and that's the equitable distribution of forests and the legacy of redlining. This is something that we uniquely experience in cities across the country because of frameworks for land use decisions that desegregated housing, disenfranchised people of color and low income, and as a result, through no fault of their own and with no control over their environment, these communities have been exposed to disproportionate levels of industrial toxins, noise, water and air pollution, less green space, less shade, and less freedom to be in control of the decisions that affect their communities. If you haven't heard about redlining, this discriminatory practice was conducted by banks, insurance companies, other financial institutions. They refused to limit or limited loans, mortgages, insurance, and other services within specific geographical areas, especially in inner city neighborhoods. This term redlining comes from the use of red lines on maps to mark out where these areas would be, where they would discriminate. These areas were often characterized as hazardous for investment, and this led to systemic disinvestment and exclusion. It disproportionately, as I said, affected people of color, low-income residents, and denied them access to essential financial resources. Now it's illegal. It was made illegal in 1968, so that wasn't that long ago, but in its wake, we're left with the inequities that require our systematic efforts to address them. You might remember this series that the Star and Trib ran last year in the fall of September 2022. I really appreciate these pieces for how they comprehensively illustrated the lasting effects of redlining in neighborhoods like Rondo, Frogtown, North Minneapolis. And it's important to note that redlining was also practiced in Rochester and Duluth, so this isn't an urban issue only. Racial covenants existed in many towns in Dakota, Ramsey, and Hennepin County in Minnesota. You can find evidence of this in the U of M's Mapping Prejudice Project, if you want to find out more. And I showcase this just to highlight, yes, these practices happened in the past, but their legacy continues to impact where we see these inequities, how communities of color were segregated, and what effect it's had on concentrations of environmental injustice. These were systematic, intentionally racist policies, and that's why we really need to engage folks who've experienced that harm in order to come to solutions. Second, when we examine the need for environmental justice engagement, it's recognizing that legacy that I spoke about, the underinvestment in our urban and community forestries. If you're just diving into this work, it might be because of these new opportunities, but I want to take a moment to acknowledge the long path it's taken. A lot of people in this room and your peers will tell you that urban and community forestry has long been viewed as a nice to do, not a need to do. And this has led to inadequate funding, under capacity management within urban and community forestry departments. In rural and small communities, often the same staff that are trimming and removing trees are also clearing snow in the winter, maintaining park spaces, and running recreation program. They really do it all. And they've only had the capacity and the authority and the resources to tend to the most pressing safety concerns and essential management tasks, oftentimes for little recognition. A lack of political and financial support has meant a lack of capacity to build a resilience-based management strategy in many communities. The threats of invasive pests, climate shifts, and the impacts of development have largely gone unaddressed until more recent investments at the state level. And there's never been a more important time to recognize the need for resources to address these concerns. And because it's been undervalued, because it's often hard and physically demanding work, tree care professionals have really, there's been a big need. There's a difficulty in training and sustaining an adequate, consistent workforce. To keep up with the demands now and into the future with all of this work that we have to do, and to be able to address justice through economic opportunities, we need to broaden our recruitment and support for underrepresented populations. I've talked to a lot of nonprofits, private tree care companies, and public sector employees who all expressed a need to make the path to employment faster and easier and more appealing to keep up with this work. There's never been a more important time to bring in people into this field that meet the needs of managing our urban forests, but to also make sure that the financial opportunities and benefits of these investments are available to more diverse communities. And to grow our field, we have to reflect our communities a lot better than we do currently. So as we shift from a nice to do to a need to do, I thought it would be really important to just reflect on this timeline to sustainable funding. Just recognizing it wasn't that long ago that it's been several decades, but since Congress first authorized UCF programs, you'll notice for the first 6 years, there was no federal investment in that. It kind of reflects a growing but really pattern of not really dedicating enough funding to it. We're not sitting there today. We've got a lot of money. Our state also recognizes what needs to happen, and they've really followed through with the types of needs that we're hearing from community, but it took us a long time to get here. So how does scarcity show up in addressing environmental justice today? This is just a sampling of comments and feedback that I've received when I ask community forestry managers about some of the community offered priorities for engagement, including getting information that's accessible, consulting them about programmings, outreach methods, and opportunities for shared decision-making around green space. And this development of planting projects or residential support programs have all been things that community members have told me they're interested in hearing more about. But I've heard things like my department doesn't have capacity to engage communities. Our staff is overwhelmed with essential programming and we can't take on residential tree support. We are able to send out mailers and flyers, but we can't engage with community members in other forms of communication and outreach. We recognize language and community barriers, but we don't have people on staff to address them. We have to rely on other departments within the city and partners to bridge this gap. And they're doing that, and they've been doing it without adequate resources. So I just want to pause and ask this question in this moment. When we look back on 2023, 2024, and the rollout of IRA, will we be able to say that this investment was used to address these community concerns? And how will that be reflected in our story? How can we use this moment to sustain investments to be able to manage our forests into the future? I think that the answer is yes, but I think that there's a lot of folks that are eager to step into this work who've just never had this opportunity or training before, and they're looking for help and support and resources to do it well. And thirdly, I think this is really important. We need to recognize and appreciate the differences in the identities of the communities that we're serving with these funds and their lived experiences, and recognize that they don't always reflect necessarily the folks that are making decisions. In workforce development discussions, I hear time and time again from communities that they don't see themselves reflected in the crews hired to conduct tree care work. They're paying attention and they're eager to be engaged around these economic opportunities and feel like seeing themselves represented in the workforce is really critical for building trust in the programs that we're hoping to run. We need to gain knowledge, empathy, and partnership to deliver these services. Only with this awareness and appreciation of differences can we hope to gain this knowledge. The intention of this funding is, yes, to serve environmental justice communities to deliver those benefits, but I believe also to involve communities in the delivery of those programs. There's a quote from the disability rights movement, and maybe folks have heard it, that really encapsulates this need to engage communities, but it's something like, nothing about us without us. And I think oftentimes we're so rushed and so busy to get the work accomplished that we're moving too fast and we're not involving people in the process. One beautiful benefit of engaging communities from diverse backgrounds in our programming is that you're building powerful partnerships. These enrich our projects. They help to build ownership and community investment in this work. And it also demonstrates the value of our programming to sustain this funding long after this one-time investment. I think if we recognize the collective power and allyship that's available to us in this opportunity, engagement would be viewed as integral to our work instead of not really getting the recognition it deserved, not getting the support from sometimes local government or prioritized by city councils and other decision-making bodies. So how can we acknowledge and address disparities in the representation as we address environmental justice? Number one, we have to recruit folks. We have to seek out voices and support to incorporate experiences of environmental injustice into our decision-making. If there are not seats at your table for environmental justice community members, then you're missing out on their perspectives. Oftentimes, and I think I have a note on here, we often look to task forces, tree boards, as voices for guidance, but often it's these positions are filled by volunteers. Often but not always, they are made up of predominantly white and older people, and I think this reflects the privilege of having the time and resources to devote or to volunteer this in addition to the passion it takes to serve. So I'm just offering up this kind of reflection about how IRA or some of our other sources of funding might be used to incentivize environmental justice community members to serve in this capacity. The benefits for this would be twofold. The added value that they bring to decision-making processes and guidance can help our work, but it also builds bridges to communities, and we're trying to reach those communities to sort of scale up a lot of our activities. And second, recognizing the need for assistance and asking for it when we don't have established trust and relationship with communities. But others do. Maybe it's your Parks and Rec department or your local health department. They have robust partnerships that focus on some of those same priority communities. They might have more established relationships and engagement programs. Ask for their help and incorporate their guidance into how you can go about engaging communities. Maybe there are also other local nonprofits, CBOs, and neighborhood associations with that rapport. We're going to talk about some conversations I've had with municipal forestry managers across the state, and they're all using these methods when they didn't have the capacity or the history with communities to engage. And third, ask your peers how they're engaging. These peer-to-peer networks, a manager I spoke to this week articulated, and it's cliche, but it's so true. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. Who's doing this work? How is it working? What have you learned? We're going to cover some of their journeys and lessons learned in reaching communities. We are all here, and I have a first-person experience of folks in this industry demonstrating a willingness to support you as you grow your program's ability to engage community members. And lastly, investing in training and resources. There's an understandable discomfort in beginning to reorient the way that we have done engagement and reorient our capacity to address issues of inequity and injustice. I'm going to offer one resource today, but know that there's a lot out there, and we're committed to providing resources and opportunities to deepen your department's understanding and comfort in engaging communities. The most important and first step is acknowledging the history and experiences of injustice, recognizing the importance of bringing in those experiences to inform your goals and planning priorities, as well as your implementation and evaluation of programs. And that's how we'll get closer to justice one step at a time. Okay, let's see. So earlier this year, my coworkers, our staff, delivered a survey and asked urban and community forestry managers about their programming. Some of the questions on that survey dealt with community engagement and canopy equity, so I thought it'd be helpful to bring it to this audience so you have more information about what your peers are saying and how they're approaching this work. A little bit more, but I'm like very dry mouth today. That's a lot of talking. We sent it out in March. It coincided, coincidentally, but not coincidentally, with our own IRA award notification, kind of scaling up in how we're going to roll out these programs. And before the open NOFO announcement, where a lot of our communities, our universities, were also able to access some funding. We got 114 responses from these audiences, and it consisted of 34 questions, like I said, covering public tree management, wood utilization, preservation ordinances, community education, engagement, and training. And here are some of the questions I just kind of cherry picked to go over. When asked when management personnel would like more assistance, 45% of folks wanted more resources to address canopy equity. You'll also note that an overwhelming majority expressed the need for private property and residential assistance. And community engagement was high on the list, as well as outreach materials. This reflects that our UCF managers recognize the need and the community interest is great. Over the next several months, we'll be offering opportunities to dig into how to build relationships with communities, how to address residential needs, and involve them in planting and maintenance activities. We recognize that some of this work is already happening in your community, but it's not necessarily happening across the state, and there's a lot of new opportunities to access funding. We recognize the need to coordinate resource sharing so we can ease some of this burden for what tools and trainings were beneficial for others in building this capacity, and making sure that we remove barriers to accessing our own grant programming for environmental justice organizations and those that serve these communities who haven't historically had access to our funding. When asked how folks engage community members, there was a pretty diverse response. So I followed up with a small sample of respondents from communities large and small across the state, and they said specifically around engaging environmental justice communities, their departments found the most success by showing up in person and providing translations of materials. They recognize engagement barriers as really paramount to understanding community readiness, interest, and capacity to participate in planting and maintenance programming. If they didn't have capacity to conduct this engagement in-house, the most effective paths to bridging these relationships were community trusted organizations and associations. Just showing up at their events or contracting with them to conduct outreach and engagement was really successful at bringing in environmental justice folks into their projects and events. Since engaging these communities, the support they've experienced in their community for UCF priorities, whether it be the development of ordinances, planting programs, and engagement around tree selection and maintenance have increased. In some instances, community members who would have otherwise not known about arborist or urban forestry job opportunities sought seasonal or permanent employment with these departments. There's still struggles to connect with communities. I don't want to sugarcoat it, and we need more resources to invest in engagement to help communities continue to strengthen these relationships. But time and time again, I've heard folks mention that these investments do take more time and energy, but they're really rewarding, and not just to the communities we're serving, but to the staff that are working with communities. It becomes a highlight of their work in a given year or multi-year project, they look back at these partnerships as some of their most rewarding work. And I think those are the compelling stories that we'll need to tell when we make sure that we have more sustained funding. Question 20, have you devoted resources to ensuring canopy equities are, canopy benefits are distributed equally? We're going to talk a little bit later about the nuances between equality, equity, and justice, but it's just important to stop here, recognize that, actually, I think this is, oh, okay, yeah, actually, my mind did a little thing. 79% said no. So how are we going to reach communities if we're not devoting resources? Maybe you haven't been able to in the past, but that's changing now. And lastly, to reiterate the importance of partnerships in accomplishing this work, are there community organizations in your community has engaged with, around, and overwhelmingly, I think are these switched, Emma, or are they? It's just how it appeared. Okay, sounds good. Yeah, that's okay. I think that the colors are not lined up, yeah. But anyways, these UCF staff at local units of governments rely on nonprofit partnerships and residential support to perform planting and maintenance duties. And we see that in communities like St. Paul. We see that in small communities throughout the state. These established relationships and partnerships are an option for expanding access to communities to participate too. So it's going to take work to make sure that the goals and objectives of your programming align with their priorities and their capacity to engage. And being mindful, like I said, of all of the history, all of the kind of context before we enter into engagement with communities is going to be vital to this being a success. But we have the precedent, we have the need and the opportunity to expand access to partnerships to accomplish this work with communities. But how? If you've sat through the first section going, yeah, I know this, I've been examining this need, but I really want to dive into practical advice, how-tos, and guidance, this is your section. I'm going to offer it, though, with a couple of caveats. It's going to be sort of like a mix-up amalgamation of my own experiences, interviews I conducted with UCF managers, also environmental justice liaisons outside of forestry programming, and some recent resources that we've been introduced to through some of our national and federal forestry partners. I'm going to offer it with humility because I really believe that your approach to engagement should necessarily reflect your communities, reflect your capacity, the support you have within your departments and the frameworks that you've already developed for engagement. And you definitely need to, or should reach out with questions, suggestions, and feedback about what I bring up so that I can make it better tailored to your needs and responsive to the interests that you have in your organization. We want to know the gaps that you're seeing and being able to conduct engagement in the way that I'm laying out, and also know how we can best support you. Let's see. So, identifying environmental justice communities. I talked with, like I said, folks from 5 communities across the state. I regularly rely and will just admit that I'm one person. I'm not going to know communities across the state. You all know your communities best. You've been doing great work, and this is just another extension of it. I have the privilege of working with some of our own regional foresters who understand how their work intersects UCF priorities, and I also reach out to communities on issue-specific DNR outreach things like firewood banking, nature access, and health impacts, right, to better understand how those networks work, but I'm pretty new at this. The second, you may have a good sense of what communities you'd like to connect with. I sent a survey to community forest managers, and they could identify pretty often race and income as qualifiers for defining communities. We also see a growing understanding of limited English proficiency. Sometimes folks would point out age and elderly folks and health vulnerabilities they experience with heat. Other folks said, pretty demonstrably, we don't necessarily target communities, but our goals are to distribute canopy in every area of our city. And that talks to equality, but not necessarily equity in targeting specific neighborhoods. So there's kind of a spectrum of folks' ability to identify who in their community would qualify for environmental justice assistance. So for state and federal funding, you know that we've had some tools to justify some of the work that you're proposing to conduct activities in. We heard that folks use, in addition to the CGES tool from the federal government and our pollution control agencies, environmental justice maps, things like Planet Geo. So it's just good to understand that you might already be using tools to identify those communities and kind of augment your own knowledge. And all of those are valuable. Let's see, this graphic here, folks may have seen it. Sometimes it's like the giving tree, but I think sometimes we stop here and thinking about how we distribute tools, and that really is good, but it doesn't get us all the way to justice. We have to recognize what are the supports that we need in place to make sure that communities are supported. How are we specifically providing those pathways towards program delivery that address their needs? So if that's new or valuable to you, I just wanted to bring that. Okay, so here's some of those tools that we talked about. I'm looking at the time and we're getting kind of, must be talking slower than I was in rehearsal. But you're probably really familiar with this tool. The Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool is something that came out of the Council on Environmental Quality. I offered here on the left for folks who are online. These are the different factors. You're probably familiar with them, but I did want to just give a little bit of context. It's good at visualizing some areas. We've also heard from communities that sometimes it can too broadly qualify an area, sometimes not reflect only low-income areas, but just bigger swaths. So recognizing some of these occurrences and then tailoring additional priorities for delivering program. We've heard from community members having sort of like a priority list demonstrating financial need, examining the canopy cover within a CGES area can help you access funding, but also ensure that the intent of the funding aligns with your program's actions, narrowing down the focus to make sure the folks most in need receive funding. If you've applied for state funding, you probably recognize this tool. This is the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's Understanding Environmental Justice in Minnesota map. One section of our applications and our grant programs handles project planning to target priority populations. Priority populations are environmental justice populations. If you've used this tool, you may have also noticed that recently our PCA map has added focus areas around language, and that's a really great improvement. You'll also need to draw from your community relationships and their stated priorities and capacity to engage your department if you hope to describe how projects are going to address their concerns. I think that there's a lot of work that goes into building those relationships that should be highlighted in those applications to demonstrate we understand how this will impact our communities. Knowing that these are consistent considerations for competitive grant funding, it can highlight the importance of building capacity to conduct engagement outside of this to your city councils, to folks who decide on budget and give you that capacity, that 10% to go out to community. Let's see. I don't know if this is going to be as helpful for folks, but it's really, the first two tools that I gave you kind of were really great broad environmental justice definition tools, but your planning might also require prioritization of planting and maintenance based on canopy equity specifically. So here are two tools that we use. Growing Shade in the metro area is a newer tool. It was developed in partnership between Met Council, Tree Trust, and the Nature Conservancy. I've kind of highlighted, and it's very, very small, so I'll just really quickly talk through some of the prioritizations you can zero in on, whether it's climate change, conservation needs, environmental justice, and public health impacts. I know that the forum has hosted the developers of that tool earlier this year. There's going to be a lot of overlap there, and you can kind of look at canopy coverage in relation to some of those intersectional interests that you hear from community members and begin to focus on their goals for your program objectives. You also have flexibility in defining a geographic area to a neighborhood, city, or census block group, which I think is helpful when we think about neighborhoods and the collective impact. Outside of the metro, we don't have as great of like specific locally made tools, but you can certainly check out the tree equity score if you haven't. I think most folks in the room probably know about it. This looks at a lot of the same factors to develop an index, like canopy cover, gaps in coverage around a census block, people experiencing poverty and people of color, as well as health burdens and heat disparities. So, understanding environmental justice priorities, I reached out to our Hennepin County Environmental Justice Liaison, so they work within the Department of Energy. And I just want to give them a shout out because they've been a really great support network. They kind of reflect this investment from other agencies and the state to prioritize environmental justice engagement in things other than forestry to date. I've really benefited from developing relationships with them, with local health departments, with forestry departments, tribal governments, other environmental health touching programs. But I would just want to name those folks here: Jasmira Colon, Joe Vital, Didier Bolanos Gonzalez, Jose Luis Villasenor, Lakota Iron Boy, Rosalba Hernandez, Alicia Bell, and Kelly Malman have all showed me how to do engagement in a really holistic way, and I've benefited from the lessons that they've taught me. So the first and foremost, is the need to develop relationships before engagement, the need to slow down so that we can go farther together. I know that this sounds really basic, but it's really true, and it's something that I bring myself to when I get kind of swept up in my deliverables, my objectives, my timelines. It's about the relationship first. I know you may be experiencing some pushback about investing this time and energy, or what that might look like now that we're administering grant programs, but we need to really push back on investing this time and adding capacity to your team. This is how we ditch the check mark and embrace authenticity. It's what communities are giving us when they give us our time and energy, and I think that's what they're looking to receive. I understand as I offer that's kind of a catch-22. Understanding community priorities and interests deeply in order to allocate resources to them is not kind of what we've been afforded on these timelines. But I see that these efforts are happening. They're happening beyond 9 to 5 and Monday through Friday. And I just want to elevate the experiences of departments who are accomplishing this in a variety of ways. Sometimes it looks like you can't add a permanent hire, but we have temporary hires like Conservation Corps members that can quickly add capacity and gather valuable insight or assign tasks that add value to your decision making. We know that oftentimes those are temporary appointments, and they should really be viewed as assistance towards that goal, or thinking about how are we thinking about permanency in some of these positions because they've invested time in building relationships with the community. Let's see, what else was I going to say about that? I've seen this play out, like I said, on the local level with the city of Minneapolis. I think the Green Zone Task Force and commissions are a great example of this. I've seen interns plan and coordinate program events, but there's always city staff there to facilitate regular meetings and ensure the group's priorities and goals have traction and are delivered to decision-making bodies. This helps to maximize the impact of the community's time and investment. Let's see. Listening to learn. Don't get so far down the definition of priorities without community input that you actually, oh, I'm like way behind. Okay, sorry. There we are. Don't get so far behind defining the priority without community engagement. So I think it's important as you begin to identify areas of focus when you're listening and just showing up in community, that you provide opportunities to envision solutions together. I think some of the resources I'll give you later on, and there'll be an opportunity to really dive into that, but just understanding solutions come in partnership with community, not from managers siloed. Okay, so let's see. These are some examples of community forestry priorities that I've been told about, and it also reflects our peers. So I spoke with those management staff across the state and checked the priorities that they've received and how they're accomplishing them or how they're addressing them. The first is around tree planting. We got some various responses from just being able to, field staff have regular work along public right-of-ways, replacing trees, but anytime that they have an opportunity to plant a new tree, making sure that they go to neighborhoods with lowest canopy cover. That's a really simple way to make sure that there's more resources being dedicated under canopy. neighborhoods. And then also looking at capacity, oftentimes in a community where there's a staff of 1 to 2 people, making sure that they work with CBOs to run some of those planting events and engage communities has been a really great way to build traction. Second, residential and private tree care company. I think the size of your department and the relationships you've developed really dictate what you're able to offer community members. But understanding these opportunities and leaning into partnership networks can help you do more with less, more outreach, education, and resource coordinating. We're kind of on the cutting edge of this too, because traditionally this hasn't been funded through state and federal funding. So we're really pioneering what this looks like in communities across the state. Let's see, these are some of the ways that departments have already been helping folks, even when they didn't have resources, just educating them on when a tree is infested or needs to come down, or the safety concerns around private property, providing some financial support, not always from government agencies, but like smaller nonprofits, those kind of things. And then resource sharing. I talked to a manager who shared that he's kind of the go-to person when anybody has a question about what do I do, they call him. And you can imagine someone who manages his entire staff, administers a whole city's budget, is always available to help connect them with arborists or resources to help them take care of the problem, even though they can't provide financial assistance. And then, okay, so we did examples from the field, and then I think this is really quite important before going out and talking to community members is being transparent and intentional about the level of engagement that you're going to be able to offer them. I don't know if folks have heard of the spectrum of public participation before. Has anybody seen this? Public health folks. But this is a tool that's used to design engagement frameworks. And it kind of falls along a spectrum from inform, consult, involve, collaborate, and empower. And I would say in general, because of capacity issues, because of background understanding and relationships, most of our natural resource staff and forestries kind of tend to stick in this inform to consult role. It's not that anyone is better or worse than another, it's just identifying this is what we're able to offer communities and this is what we're communicating. So it's not community members assuming they're going to be able to collaborate and be involved in a process when really you were just going to give them information. And I think that speaks to how you really set up patterns of trust and transparency, which are really important for engagement. Let's see, get into time. Okay, let's see. So hopefully some of the tools and frameworks that I offered you were helpful to considering like how to begin to build relationships. But I didn't want to leave you without offering some ideas for building your knowledge and skills to conduct engagement. So this is coming not just from myself, but like I said, your peers that I've talked to, and we're going to end with a resource that I recently reviewed. So let's see, these are the recommendations. Again, it's really simple, just keep coming back to it, building relationships first. I think that what managers have communicated is very helpful for this, is just demonstrating genuine interest in you thinking differently about a problem and embracing new perspectives, rather than going to community and saying, here's the solution, this is what we do, what we've always done, but really striving to partner with communities. Second is being flexible in times and format and be available. I really loved some of these. One community member stated that they distributed surveys ahead of engagement to figure out where's that best time to meet. You think about working adults, necessarily in some of our rural communities, folks that do industrial work and have longer shifts, like when can you meet? Let's design it around that. Not just calling folks to your office, but going to where groups are meeting. And they talked about a lot of community pop-up events and gathering and just setting up and tabling. I've been able to participate in that to a small degree, but at least here in the metro area, I see forestry departments doing that more and more. I love this one. There was a gentleman I talked to who set up a coffee talk at a local coffee shop. So he just bought the coffee, sat at the table, and anybody who had a tree question could come and, kind of like open office hours every week. And then communities of practice. This is back to that not reinventing the wheel. This is our first offering, but I just want to share with the audience that there's a lot of interest in engaging not only community members, but engaging your peers and colleagues in this work. And I think it's a really awesome opportunity for us to kind of share resources and just make it a little bit easier. Relying on existing infrastructure to accomplish and build these new partnerships. I think, I just think that sometimes it can be really overwhelming to think about having to do this all on your own. But the more that we can build bridges to other relationships we have within city departments, and I have some folks in the audience here who've done that and showcase like there are other resources available. How can we pull them together to meet needs? Yes, so city resources also are tree boards, neighborhood associations and businesses. And I made a note here about in each of these instances, if there's an opportunity to bring more people into that, being really intentional about who's been afforded access to these channels and how it can be broadened to include EJ community members. And lastly, letting go of ideals of perfection and fear of failure. This was everybody who I talked to who had entered in new partnership, especially around communities who have experienced harm. There's a lot of fear of failure or making mistakes, and that can hold people back from entering more meaningful, holistic engagement. Let alone the very real realities of like your capacity to show up consistently and do this work. But I think the more that we model imperfection with humility and we show that we recognize past harms and we value the assets and the strengths that communities bring to these conversations, that goes so far. I also could say when you model recovery after mistake, that's almost more important than getting it right the first time, because it's not really possible all the time. Let's see, last slide, we're almost there. This is a tool that I was made aware of in the last couple months. I also spoke with Dr. Carmichael, who helped produce this resource for the Arbor Day Foundation. And that was sponsored by the Forest Service. I put kind of some details about the training. It's really affordable. There's different ways to engage with this resource, either by participating in a live cohort that meets for 3 sessions or just watching video recordings. But a lot of the content in here is what I'm hearing folks wanting to hear more about, and it's produced really nicely. It's really digestible. So they kind of lead you through some of the same background that I went through on canopy equity and definitions, as well as how to define metrics of success for the engagement that you're going to do. And then works through skill development. How do you develop goals with community members and make plans to achieve them? So I think, you should check it out. We've reviewed it here at the DNR. I could tell you my experience, but I also, I'm eager to hear what other folks are using to train others in this field. So open to suggestions as well. And with that, I'll wrap up. That's all I came here to tell you, but I would love to like open it up to questions, comments, any concerns you had about material. Yeah, I'll repeat the question. So Valerie offered a possible follow-up to this first engagement session of maybe around how to fail. I don't know why I'm staring at the mic, the camera's there. How to fail gracefully, knowing that perfection is a false reality. But other support or different ways we can tailor these resources would be great to know. So the question was, how do you, if you're having difficulty connecting with groups or want more information or abilities to collaborate in partnership, like what are effective? Something that's been helpful for me as a non-forestry person is to recognize like the rhythms of busyness in work. And so, work days look different. Folks often get there early and leave by 3 or 4. There's also like seasonality to when they're conducting work. That's not to make excuses, but like to highlight, it might not look like your 9 to 5 work day when folks are responding to it. I think also just exercising networks. So something that I think I benefited from, now I wear a DNR hat, but I'm not an arborist, I'm not a tree care professional, but I work with folks that are, and they have connections to folks who can kind of like move some of those levers. And that's been really helpful for me to gain traction. And then I've seen modeled in our department, sometimes the needs that communities have, especially before these investments, it wasn't something that we could necessarily facilitate in some of the partnerships we've had before. So we're reaching out to social service organizations, to other like social justice type distributional organizations, like thinking outside of the box. If you're, and I don't know specifically what you'd emailed about, but just thinking about, okay, if I'm not being met here, where else can I kind of seek out help? But I will say, I feel like it is a tight, close-knit network. And I think that there are people that are willing to help you. So if you're feeling frustrated, I think that's something where Valerie's told me to make sure I preface it with I'm one person, but like reach out, because I think that those are the ways where we can be influential. It's been really weird this first year to be like, okay, I'm here to build relationships with communities, to gain trust and understand their needs more. But I'm not the person who's implementing the programs that affect them, right? And if they're not necessarily seeking grant funding from the state, that relationship looks really different. We're just here to provide support and resources. So I think that's something you could use folks like me at, or at the county level. I know that Sydney's done a lot of this work as well, works in close contact with her Parks and Rec board. So those are some suggestions. Take or leave. There is slightly different information. The methodologies in which they were developed are different. We knew from sort of troubleshooting this that there are gaps in between the two, and really advocated for being able to layer them and widening your definition of like who would qualify for this help. So they are different. They look at some similar factors, but they're not identical at all. Yeah. I really like growing shade. I don't know if I'm supposed to pitch, but something that like at the local level looks at that level of granularity, I've really appreciated. And I've seen in partnership that it's been really effective tool for planning, which I think is some of the most exciting stuff, right? Like how do we tackle new work? That's a great question. Okay, so Valerie asked me, what if my community doesn't show up on the map, but I know that there are environmental justice needs in my community? And how would I identify that? I think it's honestly what I've seen work, and what I would do is going to, so say if, I'm gonna put Austin on the map. I didn't talk to Austin, but like Austin has a pretty known history of like employing folks from other countries and other backgrounds in industrial work. So they know these communities are there. There are other ways that those communities are being served. I'd go to those organizations that serve those communities and see if there's some way that I could understand their needs around canopy equity. You might have an idea of like, here are the limitations of what I can do with my programming, but it's not until you reach out to those communities and talk to them. And I think that's back to, it's just being human and building relationships. And I really look at tree work as a vehicle for doing that. That's why I'm excited about this work. And I think that's why it's a unique opportunity that we're sitting in.
Yeah, I think that's important that folks are engaging with communities just in ways that are maybe not environmentally focused.
Thank you. I'm going to repeat that. Yeah, what Valerie said is like, it's not that people aren't being engaged. There are other folks engaging folks, but they might not be doing it around environmental needs specifically or around tree needs specifically. But there are intersections and overlap in how tree programming can be used to benefit communities who experience injustice. Thank you so much for your time and my like nervous energy and my note reading, but this recording will be available. Please distribute it to your friends. And really what I'm hoping to get out of this is, now that we've had a conversation, tell me how to show up better, show me where those needs are, make sure that whatever I'm doing helps support y'all's work. Thank you.